The rain fell hard on Fort Benning that March morning, and Captain James Morrison sat in the small coffee shop just outside the base gates, staring at his phone. He didn't want to make the call, but protocol required it. His hand trembled as he scrolled through the contact information for the next of kin. When he found the name, Margaret Maggie Chen, he took a deep breath and dialed. 300 miles away in a small suburban home in Raleigh, North Carolina, Maggie's mother answered on the second ring. Captain Morrison's words came out carefully, professionally, but they landed like a bomb. Her daughter, First Lieutenant Sarah Chen, had been marked as killed in action. Missing in combat, presumed dead. The phone went silent except for the sound of braking. Nobody who knew Sarah ever thought she would make it this far. Not really. Not deep down where the truth lived. Sarah Chen grew up as the middle child in a family of high achievers. Her older brother was a surgeon. Her younger sister had already published a novel. Their parents, both immigrants who had built successful lives from nothing, had always pushed for perfection, for prestige, for respect. Sarah, the quiet one, the one who didn't shine quite as bright as the others, had always felt the weight of those expectations pressing down on her shoulders. When she announced at age 17 that she wanted to join the army, her parents had been devastated. Not angry, devastated. In their eyes, the military was not a career for someone like Sarah. It was a waste. Her mother cried. Her father suggested she was running away instead of running towards something. The fights that followed had scarred her in ways she never quite healed. But Sarah had needed something her family couldn't give her. She needed to prove something. Not to them, she had learned early that their approval might never come. She needed to prove it to herself. She enlisted at 18 and never looked back. From the very beginning, Sarah faced resistance. Her drill sergeant at basic training, a thick-necked man named Sergeant Pierce, had a habit of making examples out of soldiers who didn't fit his image of what the perfect soldier should be. And Sarah, with her slight frame and her quiet demeanor, had fit that profile perfectly. "You're too soft for this," he would shout in her face, his voice echoing across the training grounds. "Your parents should have raised you to be a real soldier, not some delicate flower." The other recruits would laugh or they would look away. Neither response felt good, but Sarah had learned to absorb the hits without flinching. She had been absorbing blows her whole life. Yet something shifted in Sarah over those first 8 weeks. With each exercise that nearly broke her, she got stronger. With each insult hurled at her, she learned to transmute the pain into fuel. She watched the men around her, learned their techniques, studied the way their bodies moved. She didn't have their natural strength, so she developed something else. Tactical awareness, precision, and an almost preternatural ability to read situations before they unfolded. By graduation day, Sarah Chen had not only completed basic training, she had excelled. Her final scores placed her in the top 5% of her class. Sergeant Pierce, standing on the parade ground as Sarah received her award, looked genuinely stunned. But Sarah barely registered his shock. She was already looking forward. Officer Candidate School came next, and with it came a new set of challenges. The academy was designed to break people down and rebuild them. Most candidates who entered never made it to the end. The physical tests were brutal, but the psychological evaluations were worse. They dug into your mind, looking for weakness, for doubt, for the cracks where pressure could be applied. Sarah made it through by being invisible. She didn't draw attention. She didn't boast. She simply did the work, and she did it better than almost everyone else. By the time she received her commission as a first lieutenant, she had become something new, a soldier, yes, but something more than that. She had become a woman who had learned to trust herself in a way she never had before. Her first posting was to Fort Bragg, where she was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. The commanding officer, Colonel Richard Thompson, took one look at her file and frowned. Women in special operations were still relatively new, and Thompson was old school. He believed women had a place in the military, but that place was not in direct combat operations. He made his feelings known in a meeting 2 days after Sarah's arrival. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, his tone measured but cold, "I've reviewed your file, your scores are impressive, but this unit is different. We operate in theater. We operate in places where hesitation gets people killed. I need soldiers who have killed before. I need soldiers who don't think twice." Sarah stood at attention, her face betraying nothing. "Sir, I'm prepared to do whatever is required of me." Thompson leaned back in his chair. "That's the problem, Lieutenant. I don't think you are, and I'm not going to be the one to find out the hard way. You'll be staying on base. You'll take the training, but you won't deploy. That's not a request. That's a direct order." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, sir. Understood, sir." She turned to leave his office, and that's when Thompson added one more thing, almost as an afterthought. "You remind me of my daughter," he said. "She's bright, too. She's going to make something of herself, but not in a war zone. Neither will you, Lieutenant Chen." Sarah didn't respond. She walked out of his office, down the hallway, and found an empty supply closet where she sat in the dark for 30 minutes and let herself cry. Not for herself, but for the girl she had been before this moment, the girl who had believed that if she worked hard enough, she could overcome anything. 3 years passed. 3 years of Sarah watching from the sidelines, training the new recruits, managing logistics, doing all the jobs that no one else wanted to do. 3 years of feeling like she was wasting the best years of her life, locked behind a desk while the soldiers she had trained were out doing the work that mattered. The other soldiers pitied her, she knew. First Lieutenant Chen, the one who never got to deploy, the one who didn't have what it took. Or so everyone believed. But Sarah had been using those 3 years wisely. She had studied every after-action report from combat operations. She had attended every seminar, every training session, every intelligence briefing she could squeeze into her schedule. She had become an expert in warfare tactics, in enemy movements, in the kind of survival skills that would keep a team alive when things went wrong. She was waiting for her moment. She just didn't know it was coming so soon. In January of that year, Colonel Thompson was transferred. His replacement, Colonel Patricia Sanderson, was different. She was tough, but she was fair. She looked at Sarah's file on her first day and called her into the office. "I'm deploying the 82nd to Afghanistan," Sanderson said, not wasting any time with pleasantries. "I see here that Thompson kept you stateside. Do you want to tell me why?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "Colonel Thompson believed I didn't have the experience necessary for combat operations." Sanderson studied her for a long moment. "And what do you believe, Lieutenant?" "I believe I'm ready, ma'am." Sanderson smiled, not cruelly, but with respect. "Okay, you're going. You'll be leading a reconnaissance team. I'm putting you in charge of 5 soldiers. Your job will be to gather intelligence in the Kanhar province. It's not going to be easy. The terrain is rough. The enemy is smart and well-armed. But if anyone on this base can handle it, it's you. I've read the reports, Chen. I know what you've been doing for the past 3 years. You've been preparing for this." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. For the first time in her life, someone in authority saw her not as a liability, but as an asset. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me yet," Sanderson said. "Bring your team home safely, and then we'll talk about gratitude." The deployment began 2 weeks later. Sarah's team consisted of 5 soldiers. Sergeant Mike Hartford, a veteran with 2 previous deployments, Corporal Jake Martinez, young and eager, Private First Class David "Doc" Williams, the unit medic, Private Tom Bradley, a former construction worker with nerves of steel, and Specialist Lisa Park, the youngest member of the team at just 23. They trained together intensely for those 2 weeks, getting to know each other's habits, learning to anticipate each other's moves, building the kind of trust that would be necessary when bullets started flying. Sarah was careful, methodical, and fair. She didn't demand more from her team than she demanded from herself, and she didn't ask them to take risks she wasn't willing to take. Her soldiers respected her. More than that, they trusted her. On the night before deployment, Sarah sat in her bunk and wrote a letter to her mother. She didn't know why. She wasn't a person who usually did things like that, but something told her it was important. "Mom," she wrote, "if you're reading this, things didn't go according to plan, but I want you to know that I never regretted my choice to serve. For the first time in my life, I know who I am. I'm not the daughter who wasn't good enough. I'm not the sister who didn't shine bright enough. I'm a soldier, and I'm proud of that. I'm leading soldiers who believe in me and who I believe in. That's worth more than any approval from anyone, including you. I love you, and I hope that someday you understand." She sealed the letter and gave it to her chaplain, with instructions that it only be opened if something happened to her. Then she packed her gear, said goodbye to the handful of people who had believed in her, and boarded the plane to Afghanistan. The Kanhar province was nothing like what Sarah had imagined from the briefing documents. No photograph, no report, no simulation could have prepared her for the reality of it. The mountains rose up in sharp, jagged peaks that seemed to scratch at the sky. The valleys were thick with vegetation that could hide an army. The roads, or what passed for roads, were barely more than goat paths carved into the mountainside. Sarah's first week was spent establishing a forward operating base in a small village called Qasadar. The village had been cleared by previous operations, but the Taliban presence was never far away. Every night, Sarah could hear gunfire echoing across the valleys. Every morning, she would brief her team on what needed to be done. Their mission was simple in concept, complex in execution. Gather intelligence on Taliban supply lines and report back to headquarters. They would spend weeks in the field, living out of their packs, moving through terrain that could kill them just as surely as enemy bullets. Sergeant Hartford was Sarah's second-in-command, and he was skeptical of her at first. Oh, he was professional about it. She could see it in the way his eyes would linger on her during briefings, searching for signs of weakness. He had been fighting in wars for 15 years. He didn't have much faith in a first lieutenant who had never seen combat. But Sarah knew this already. She had expected it. So when she set the pace on their first patrol, she made sure it was a pace that would test her team but not break them. When they encountered their first Taliban scouts, Sarah's training kicked in, and she made the call to withdraw and report the position rather than engage. It was the smart choice. They were outnumbered and didn't have air support available. When they returned to base and reported what they had found, Colonel Sanderson approved Sarah's decision. The information led to a successful airstrike that eliminated the Taliban position before it could move. Sanderson personally commended Sarah and her team. After that, Hartford's skepticism began to fade. Over the next month, Sarah's team conducted 12 successful reconnaissance missions. They moved through terrain that most soldiers would have given up on. They gathered intelligence that proved to be accurate and valuable. They began to develop a reputation, not just in their unit, but throughout the regiment. But with that reputation came danger. The Taliban had taken notice of the 82nd's reconnaissance operations. More specifically, they had taken notice of Sarah's team. Intelligence reports suggested that the Taliban had put out a bounty on the American soldiers who were disrupting their supply lines. But there was something more personal about their interest in Sarah. The reports mentioned a female officer. They seemed to want her specifically. No one knew why. Speculation ran wild. Had she killed an important Taliban commander? Had she destroyed a particularly valuable cache of weapons? Had she done something that wounded their pride? The truth was simpler and more complicated. Sarah had made herself into a symbol. Every time she defeated them, she disproved their fundamental belief that women were weak, that Western soldiers were soft, that American military was losing its edge. To the Taliban, she represented the exact thing they feared most. In week 6 of the deployment, everything changed. Sarah received new orders from Sanderson. There was a high-value Taliban target in the mountains, a commander named Ahmed Khalil, who had been orchestrating attacks on American positions for years. Intelligence suggested he was moving through the area, and there was a window of opportunity to capture or kill him. The mission was dangerous. The terrain was worse than anything Sarah had operated in before, and Sanderson had made it clear that this was a volunteer operation only. Sarah didn't hesitate. "My team and I will take it, ma'am." Sanderson looked at her for a long moment. "This could get you killed, Chen." "Yes, ma'am, but it could also end the threat that's been targeting us. I believe we have the best chance of success." Sanderson nodded. "All right, you have 2 days to prepare. You deploy at dawn." Sarah gathered her team and laid out the mission parameters. To her surprise, every single soldier volunteered to go. Hartford, Martinez, Williams, Bradley, Park, they were all in. They trusted her, and that trust was not something Sarah took lightly. The next 2 days were spent in intensive preparation. Sarah studied the terrain maps until she could draw them from memory. She worked with intelligence to identify the most likely routes Khalil would take. She planned 3 contingency scenarios, one for if they encountered resistance, one for if Khalil was not at the location, and one for a rapid extraction if things went sideways. The night before the mission, Sarah gathered her team around a map. "This is going to be hard," she told them honestly. "We're going to be moving through terrain that could kill us before we even see the enemy. We're going to be far from support. If something goes wrong, we might not be able to call for help immediately. But I want you to know that I've thought through every possible scenario, and I believe we can do this. I believe we can get Ahmed Khalil or the information we need to find him. And I believe we can all come home." She looked each of them in the eye. "I'm not going to tell you this is going to be easy, but I'm going to tell you that if you follow my lead and if you trust each other, we will survive. Are you with me?" "Yes, ma'am," they answered, and Sarah heard something in their voices that hadn't been there before. Not just respect, but genuine belief. They believed in her so completely that they were willing to follow her into the heart of Taliban territory. The mission began at dawn. Sarah's team hiked into the mountains, moving carefully through valleys and across ridges. The plan was to position themselves on a ridge overlooking the suspected location by nightfall, then move in for the intercept the following morning. For the first 18 hours, everything went according to plan. The team moved efficiently, conserving energy, staying alert but not panicked. As darkness fell, they reached the ridge and positioned themselves in the rocks, looking down at a small compound tucked into the mountainside below. Through thermal imaging, they could see heat signatures in the compound. Multiple people, possibly Khalil, but they couldn't be sure. Sarah made the decision to wait. They would observe through the night and make the final identification in the morning when they could see more clearly. It was a decision that saved their lives. Around 2 a.m., Sarah heard the sound. Footsteps. Multiple people moving up the mountain toward their position. Her heart rate spiked, but she kept her voice calm. "Everyone, we have company, tactical positions. Hold fire until I give the order." Her team moved like ghosts, repositioning themselves behind rocks and into shadows. Sarah watched the approaching soldiers, 20, maybe 30 Taliban fighters climbing toward the ridge. They moved with purpose. They knew exactly where they were going. Someone had betrayed them. Someone had told the Taliban where the American team was positioned. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities, but she didn't have time to process them. She had to focus on survival. She watched the Taliban fighters get closer and closer, and when they were just 50 meters away, she made her first mistake, or what would later look like her first mistake. She gave the order to open fire. The firefight that erupted was chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the mountainside. Bullets sang through the air, striking rock and flesh. Sarah's team fought with precision, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. Within the first minute, Private Tom Bradley was hit in the shoulder. Within 2 minutes, Corporal Jake Martinez went down with a wound to the leg. "Fall back," Sarah ordered. "We're moving down the mountain now." Her team began to retreat, using covering fire, moving from rock to rock. Sarah stayed in position, laying down suppressing fire, giving her people time to get clear. She was so focused on keeping the Taliban fighters at bay that she didn't notice the grenade until it was too late. The explosion was enormous. The world turned white, then red. Sarah felt pain like nothing she had ever experienced, sharp, burning, all-consuming. She tried to move and found that her left leg wasn't responding correctly. She looked down and saw blood, a lot of blood. She tried to shout, but her voice came out as a whisper. Someone was screaming her name. She recognized the voice. It was Hartford, calling to her. She tried to respond, but the world was getting darker. The last thing she remembered was the sound of helicopters coming in to extract her team. She had the vague sense of being lifted, of Doc Williams' hands trying to stop the bleeding, of voices shouting medical jargon that she couldn't quite parse. The funeral was held on a gray day in April. Sarah's mother sat in the front pew of the chapel on Fort Bragg, her face an absolute mask of composed grief. Her husband sat beside her, his hand never leaving her shoulder. Sarah's brother and sister sat behind them, their faces marked with the particular pain of losing a sibling to a cause they had never quite understood. But their grief was based on a lie. Colonel Patricia Sanderson stood at the podium and gave a speech about sacrifice, about duty, about the price of freedom. She talked about Sarah as though she had known her, as though the connection was more than professional. In a way, it was. Sanderson had believed in Sarah when no one else had. She had given her the chance to prove herself, and now that belief felt like it had led directly to her death. The casket in front of the chapel was empty. There was nothing to bury. The explosion that had wounded Sarah had also taken the lives of 8 Taliban fighters, but more importantly, it had done something else entirely. It had created a situation so chaotic, so confused in the fog of war, that when the smoke cleared, no one could account for Sarah's body. The official report stated that she had died from her wounds, that her body had been lost in the fighting, that she was gone. But in a military hospital 500 miles away, in a facility that specialized in treating soldiers with catastrophic injuries, Sarah Chen was very much alive. She had drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days after the extraction. When she finally woke up fully, it was to the face of Doc Williams sitting in a chair beside her hospital bed. "Welcome back," Williams said, his voice raw with emotion. "We thought we lost you." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Williams helped her drink some water, and then she asked the question she needed answered. What happened? Williams took a deep breath. There was so much confusion after the explosion. You were bleeding out. I did what I could, but I couldn't stop it completely. The helicopter got you to the field hospital just in time. They did emergency surgery, saved your life. But Sarah... He trailed off, and Sarah understood without him finishing. She had lost her left leg below the knee. The damage was too severe, and amputation was the only option that had kept her alive. Sarah lay in the hospital bed and tried to process this information. Her career as a combat soldier was over. Her ability to lead reconnaissance teams, to move through mountains, to be the woman she had fought so hard to become, all of it was gone. She felt the tears come, but she didn't try to stop them. Over the next week, Sarah learned more details. Her team had escaped. Hartford, Martinez, Williams, Bradley, and Park had all made it out alive. The mission had succeeded in a strange way. Ahmed Khalil had been in the compound, and he had been killed by an airstrike that came in after Sarah's team extracted. But there was something else, something that Williams brought to her on day 9 of her hospital stay. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he said, closing the door to her room behind him. "Something I haven't reported to anyone else, not yet. When we were moving down the mountain after you started laying down covering fire, I heard someone, a Taliban fighter, shouting in Dari. I don't speak Dari, but Hartford was with me and he does a little. He told me what the guy was saying." "What?" Sarah asked, her voice still weak. "The Taliban knew exactly where we were. Exactly. They knew our position, our numbers, everything. That didn't happen by chance, Sarah. Someone told them." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Who? How?" "I don't know, but I know it wasn't random. And I know that you need to be careful, because whoever did this, they probably think you're dead. And if they find out you're alive, they might want to make sure that stays not true." Sarah looked at Williams. "We need to report this." "To who?" Williams asked. "We don't know if it's someone from our own unit. We don't know how high it goes. If we report it to the wrong person, we might be signing our own death sentences." Over the next month, as Sarah went through rehabilitation, she began to piece together what had happened. There had been intelligence failures that led to the ambush, questions about how the Taliban had known the team's position, official investigations that seemed to go nowhere. And then, like a door slamming shut, the investigation stopped. The incident was classified. The file was sealed. And Sarah was officially declared deceased. She didn't find out until 6 weeks after the surgery, when a nurse made a passing comment about how terrible it was that she had been killed in action. Sarah had demanded to see her official military file, and there it was. First Lieutenant Sarah Chen, KIA, May 6, presumed lost in combat. There was a funeral held, an empty casket, medals of valor presented to her family. A flag folded and handed to her mother, who Sarah learned later had wept openly for the first time in 30 years. The emotional toll of seeing her own death officially recorded was almost worse than the physical pain of losing her leg. She had been erased, written out of history. And then something shifted. Sarah began to pay attention to the details in her hospital file. She noticed that her release from the military hospital was being arranged. She would be transferred to a Veterans Affairs hospital, then released as a disabled veteran. Her records would be sealed. She would receive a pension for her disability, but she would be quietly shuffled away from active duty. She would be forgotten. One night, unable to sleep, Sarah lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, and she made a decision. Someone had betrayed her team. Someone had put them in a position to be ambushed. That someone had then covered it up, and those covers would hold as long as Sarah remained dead and buried. But Sarah wasn't dead, and she wasn't going to let whoever did this get away with it. She started making phone calls. She started writing letters. She documented everything she could remember about the mission, about the ambush, about the fact that it had been no accident. She sent copies to journalists, to military oversight committees, to anyone who might take her seriously. And then she waited to see what would happen. The response took 6 months. A journalist from the Washington Post arrived at her VA hospital room on a gray November morning. Her name was Rebecca Hartley, and she had been investigating missing incident reports from Afghanistan for 2 years. "I received an anonymous tip about your case," Hartley said, settling into a chair across from Sarah's bed. "It took me a while to track down where you were. The military really doesn't want people to know you're alive." Sarah told her everything. Every detail of the mission, the ambush, the intelligence failure, the cover-up. She talked about the decision to declare her dead, about the official investigations that went nowhere, about the way the file had been sealed and classified. Hartley listened to every word, and when Sarah was finished, she said something that changed everything. "I know who betrayed you," Hartley said. "I can't prove it yet, but I know." The man's name was Major David Cortez, and he had been working as a liaison between the American military and various Afghan government officials. On paper, Cortez was a good soldier. He had a 17-year service record, multiple deployments, and a reputation as someone who got things done. In reality, he was a spy for a corrupt Afghan warlord who had been working to eliminate threats to his operations. Ahmed Khalil, the Taliban commander that Sarah had been sent to capture or kill, had been a rival to the warlord's power. By sabotaging Sarah's team and ensuring that Khalil knew they were coming, Cortez had been serving two masters, the warlord who wanted Khalil dead and the Taliban who wanted American soldiers dead. The ambush had been designed to accomplish both goals. Khalil would be eliminated by the resulting airstrike, and the American team would be destroyed or captured. That both things had actually happened, that Khalil had died and that Sarah's team had escaped with only one casualty, was a matter of luck and Sarah's tactical brilliance. What Cortez hadn't anticipated was that Sarah would survive her wounds. He had been briefed that she had died in the explosion. When Colonel Sanderson had officially reported her as KIA, Cortez had relaxed. The threat was neutralized. Rebecca Hartley's investigation into Cortez had started years before she ever heard about Sarah. She had been looking into Afghan corruption, into American military officials who seemed to have unexplained wealth and connections. It had taken her 2 years of reporting, investigation, and verification, but she had built a case that tied Cortez to at least 12 separate incidents where American soldiers had been put in harm's way because of information they had leaked to Taliban or warlord contacts. But without a surviving witness, without someone who could testify about the betrayal directly, the case was circumstantial. Cortez was smart enough to have covered his tracks. There were no smoking gun emails, no recorded conversations, nothing that could definitively prove he was the one who had betrayed Sarah's team. Until Sarah came forward. "I heard him," Sarah told Hartley. "I didn't see him, but I heard him. After the explosion, when I was trying to crawl toward cover, I heard an American voice on the radio. Someone was coordinating with the Taliban fighters. Someone was telling them where we were moving. And I heard that person call himself Cortez when he confirmed a Taliban fighter's report." "You're sure?" Hartley asked. "There's no possibility you were mistaken or that you misheard." "I'm sure," Sarah said. "I was trained to identify voices. It was Cortez." With Sarah's testimony, Hartley had what she needed. She went to her editors at the Washington Post and pitched the story. It was massive, a decorated military officer working as a spy, soldiers killed and wounded because of his actions, a massive security breach that reached into the highest levels of military intelligence. The Post began its own investigation to verify everything. They had lawyers review the evidence. They reached out to Sarah's surviving team members, and each of them confirmed her account. They found documentation of the sealed investigation, the classified files, the official acknowledgement that there had been questions about intelligence failures. And then they ran the story. The headline was simple and devastating. "Decorated military officer accused of spying for Taliban. Pentagon covered up security breach." The story detailed everything: the ambush, the betrayal, the fact that Sarah had been declared KIA to cover up the security lapse, the damage that Cortez had caused over his years of espionage, the lives lost, the soldiers wounded, the operations compromised. Within hours, the military's response was damage control mode. Major David Cortez was arrested and formally charged with espionage, treason, and conspiracy to commit murder. Military investigators descended on every operation he had been involved in over the past 5 years. But there was a problem, a big one. Cortez wasn't talking, and his lawyers were very, very good. Without a confession, without more direct evidence, the case against him was still circumstantial. Yes, there was Sarah's testimony, but in a military court, a recording or documentation would be more powerful than the word of a soldier who had been wounded and was believed to have been dead for months. The military establishment was hoping that Sarah would fade away, that her testimony would be written off as unreliable or emotional. They were hoping the story would blow over. They weren't counting on Sarah Chen. The military court-martial of Major David Cortez began on a cold January morning, 13 months after the ambush in the Kanhar province. Sarah sat in the courtroom in her wheelchair, wearing her dress uniform modified to accommodate her prosthetic leg. She had not been able to march into that courtroom, but she had chosen to be wheeled in slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone could see exactly what Cortez's betrayal had cost. The prosecution laid out its case with clinical precision. Intelligence analysts testified about the communication records. Military investigators presented findings about the security breaches. Communication specialists explained how signals intercepts had confirmed that someone in the American military had been passing information to the Taliban. And then Sarah took the stand. She was sworn in, and the prosecuting attorney, a colonel named Margaret Hoffman, began with a simple question. First Lieutenant Chen, can you please describe your mission on May 5th? Sarah told the story again, how the team had been ambushed, how they had fought their way out, how the explosion had wounded her severely. She spoke in a steady voice without emotion, just facts, but the facts were devastating. When the defense attorney, a civilian lawyer named Richard Sands, who had been brought in from one of the top military law firms in the country, began his cross-examination, he tried to punch holes in her testimony. Isn't it true, First Lieutenant, that you had been severely wounded, that you were in shock and pain, that your perception of events might have been compromised? It's possible, Sarah said calmly. But what I heard clearly. There are only so many men in the army who go by Cortez, and the voice on the radio was unmistakably Major Cortez's voice. I had worked with him 3 times before. I knew his voice. But you didn't see him, Sands pressed. You didn't see him committing any crime. You only heard a voice. I heard him coordinate with Taliban fighters, Sarah said. I heard him confirm their position reports. I heard him tell them where my team was moving. That is espionage. Sands tried several more angles, but Sarah didn't waver. She had prepared for this testimony. She had spent months reviewing the recordings of Cortez's voice, confirming in her own mind that what she had heard was accurate. When her testimony ended, Sarah wheeled herself out of the courtroom with the same deliberate slowness that she had wheeled herself in. The cameras waiting outside the building captured her, and the images spread across every news network in America. A wounded soldier, a female soldier, a soldier who had been declared dead by her own military, demanding justice. The court-martial continued for 3 weeks. The evidence piled up. Then, in a stunning development, the prosecution presented something new. A recording. Buried in classified communication archives, military investigators had found a transmission from the day of the ambush. It was audio only, and the quality was degraded, but with modern audio analysis, they could enhance it. And when they played it for the court, the voice was unmistakable. It was Cortez, directing Taliban fighters to the American team's position. The defense had no answer to that. Sands tried to suggest that the recording had been doctored, that it was circumstantial, that it didn't prove anything except that someone who sounded like Cortez had been on a communication network. It didn't necessarily mean he had been acting as a spy. But the jury, a military jury composed of officers from various branches, didn't believe him. The evidence was overwhelming. The recording, combined with Sarah's testimony, combined with the intelligence analysis, told a clear story. It took the jury 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Major David Cortez was sentenced to life in military prison. He stood in the courtroom as the sentence was read, his face a mask of cold fury. But as he turned to be led away, his eyes found Sarah's, and in that moment she saw something that surprised her. It wasn't anger or hatred, it was fear. He was afraid of her. A wounded woman in a wheelchair had brought him down. The courtroom erupted with applause, unusual in a military court, but the judge didn't try to suppress it. The journalists rushed outside to file their stories. The networks began their coverage. Sarah's name trended on every social media platform in America. But Sarah didn't stay to celebrate. She was wheeled out of the courtroom by an aide, and she left the courthouse through a side entrance where a car was waiting. She needed to go home. The rain was falling when Sarah's car pulled up to her parents' house in Raleigh. It was the same house she had grown up in, the same driveway where she had played as a child. the same front door that she had walked through thousands of times in her life. She hadn't set foot in that house in 6 years. The physical therapist who had been assigned to help her with rehabilitation had come along for the trip, but Sarah asked for a moment alone before going inside. She sat in the car, watching the rain streak down the windows, and she tried to figure out what she wanted to say to the people inside that house. Her mother had been at the court-martial. She had sat in the back of the courtroom and watched her daughter testify. Margaret Chen had cried, not with grief this time, but with something that looked like pride and regret mixed together. Sarah took a deep breath and wheeled herself out of the car. The physical therapist had brought a motorized wheelchair for outdoor mobility, and Sarah used it now, rolling up the driveway toward the front door. Before she could knock, the door swung open. Her mother stood there, her face marked with lines that hadn't been there 6 years ago, her hair more gray than Sarah remembered. "Sarah," she said, and her voice broke on the single word. Sarah looked at her mother for a long moment, and then she spoke. "I brought you something," she said. "I brought you the truth. You can never say again that I was weak. You can never say again that I threw my life away. I served my country. I led soldiers. I took down a spy. I faced down the greatest fear a soldier can face, the threat of death, and I didn't break. I didn't run. I stayed and I fought and I won." Her mother came down the steps and knelt beside Sarah's wheelchair. "I know," she said. "I've always known. I just didn't know how to tell you. I just didn't know how to be proud of you without being afraid for you." "That's what I figured out," Sarah said. "It's okay to be proud. It's okay to be afraid. Those things can both be true at the same time." Her father appeared in the doorway, and then her brother and sister. They stood there in the rain, looking at Sarah, really looking at her, not as a daughter or sibling who had disappointed them or confused them, but as a warrior who had proven something that needed to be proven. That strength comes in many forms. That courage isn't the absence of fear. That a woman can stand alone against impossible odds and win. Inside the house, sitting at the dinner table, the family talked for hours. Sarah told her parents about the military, about the soldiers she had led, about the moment when she realized she didn't need their approval anymore because she had something better. She had her own respect. She told them about the betrayal, about the ambush, about waking up in the hospital and discovering that she had been declared dead. "I was so angry," she said. "Not just at Cortez, but at everyone, at the military for covering it up, at the system that tried to erase me, but you know what I realized?" "What?" her mother asked. "I realized that they couldn't erase me because I existed, because I had done things that mattered, because I had led soldiers and brought them home safely, because I had taken down a traitor and got justice. That's all real. That's all permanent. It doesn't matter what some official report says. The truth is the truth." The next morning, Sarah stood in her childhood bedroom, looking at the photographs on the wall. Pictures of her as a child, as a teenager, as a young woman. Pictures of her graduation from high school, from college, from the academy. The most recent photograph was from her commissioning as an officer. She was standing in her dress uniform, smiling with genuine pride, already beginning to understand what it meant to be a soldier. She turned away from those photographs and looked at herself in the mirror. Her left leg ended below the knee. She had scars that would never fully fade. There were parts of her that had been broken and could only be repaired with prosthetics and physical therapy. But her eyes were clear and her shoulders were straight, and she knew exactly who she was. First Lieutenant Sarah Chen, United States Army, decorated officer, survivor. The woman who nobody believed in, who the military marked as KIA, who came back and turned the war against the traitors. 3 weeks later, Colonel Patricia Sanderson presented Sarah with a Medal of Valor in a ceremony at Fort Bragg. The official citation read, "For extraordinary heroism while engaged in operations against an armed enemy." What it should have said was, "For refusing to disappear, for refusing to be erased, for refusing to accept a lie about who she was." Sarah stood on her prosthetic leg perfectly still as the medal was placed around her neck. In the audience, her mother watched with tears in her eyes, not tears of fear this time, tears of genuine pride. "What happens now?" her mother asked that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Now I figure out who I am as a soldier without being able to do all the things I did before," Sarah said. "I'm going to work with the military on recruitment and retention. I'm going to train new soldiers. I'm going to tell them what I wish someone had told me when I was starting out." "And what's that?" her mother asked. "That the people who matter will believe in you, that your strength isn't about your physical abilities, that sometimes the greatest battles aren't the ones fought on mountains in Afghanistan. They're the ones fought inside yourself, against the voice that tells you that you're not good enough. And that if you're willing to fight hard enough, if you're willing to get back up every time you're knocked down, you can turn any situation around. You can prove everyone wrong. You can come back from being marked as dead and show the whole world that you were never gone at all." Her mother reached over and took Sarah's hand, and they sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. In the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of military aircraft flying overhead, heading toward some distant base, carrying soldiers on their own journeys of discovery and courage. She knew their struggles. She knew what it meant to be doubted, to be underestimated, to be told that you didn't have what it took. And she knew what it felt like to prove everyone wrong. The war that had marked her as killed in action had instead awakened her to a truth that no one could ever take away. She was unstoppable. She was strong, and her story was far from over.